perspective. And normally, you would not have a guest speaker on the first Sunday of the year, because who would do that? But anyway, Nate's grandmother, lovingly referred to as Abuela, is not doing very well. She hasn't been doing well for a while, but she's really, really not doing well. In the kind of way that I told my husband that I would preach for him if he flew out to New York yesterday and stayed by her side, because she has to have someone at her side in the nursing home 24/7, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the next few days. That kind of not doing well. So, 7 o'clock yesterday morning, I said, if you decided to fly out and miss the sermon, I don't think anyone at the church would be upset with you, but you would be upset with yourself if you got there a little bit too late. And no one's going to care in 5 years whether I preach today, but you will care in 5 years if I preach today. So just go. So we found a ticket, bought the ticket, drove to Fort Wayne, and left yesterday. It was fun. So that's why I didn't read my chat. The day I should have read the chapter, did not read the chapter. So, moral of the story, I think I've seen these slides 2 times, and we're going to do this together, and it's going to be great. And I also think it's very ironic that I have to preach about suffering, because this is probably the number one lesson that God has taught me since we've gotten married, and it is the most annoying lesson. I have hated every moment of learning everything that I have to say right now. He's watching this with his grandmother, and he's probably nodding and chuckling. Don't chuckle at me, man, all right? I was, when he was like, well, I already have it written because it's tomorrow. So just, if you want to just use my slides. And I was like, yeah. And then I'm looking at them, I'm like, oh, this is terrible. I don't like any of this. Could we do another week first? That's not how it works, because it's based on Romans 5, and I am not allowed to rewrite the Bible. So let's take a look at Romans 5. It says, not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard this passage before. I've heard it before. And I always kind of hated it, because it started out with suffering, which I didn't like and I didn't think was very fair. But I don't get to pick what's fair. God gets to pick what's fair, because he knows the ending. And the only reason I think it's unfair is because I don't know how it ends. I was not looking forward to preaching this message, and I think that it's one of those messages where I'm going to have to preach to myself, and you guys just get to listen. So, congratulations to you. All right, next, let's take a look at this quote from Oswald Chambers. We all know people who have been made much meaner and more irritable and more intolerable to live with by suffering. It is not right to say that all suffering perfects. It only perfects one type of person, the person who accepts the call of God in Christ Jesus. So Nate showed me that quote yesterday, and I went, oh, that's terrible. I think that was my exact phrase. Because this was me for years, and probably my default setting. People who have been made much meaner and more irritable and more intolerable to live with by suffering. That was me. It's probably still me, and I'm glad we can't see my husband nodding right now, so let's pretend he's not, shall we? Not all suffering perfects. It only perfects us if we allow it to. It only perfects us if we choose for it to. On Mother's Day, I preached on Abraham and how Abraham was told by God to go sacrifice Isaac. And he decided to name the mountain on which that happened a name that brought hope and remembrance. He could have named it something in bitterness, but he didn't. He chose. And that's what this quote is talking about. I love this quote and hate it all at the same time, because we are choosing how we look at suffering. And that's kind of what we're going to look at today. It's going to be the start of our reset. So, first we're going to look at why we suffer. After we look at why we suffer, we're going to look a little bit at the different kinds of suffering. We can either suffer to lose, or we can suffer to learn. So let's take a look at why we suffer. We're only going to look at this briefly, because in February, Mr. Nate is going to be doing a whole series on why, pretty much hard questions. One of the hard questions is, why do bad things happen? So there's going to be a whole series on that. So we're not going to go into this in great detail today, but that's a teaser for you for February, because he used to teach an ethics class. So he has done all the research and done all the things for this. This is good. Like you're going to like this. Can I look at all of your eyes? February is going to be a good month for you, all right? Because you have an ethics teacher up here going over questions like, why do bad things happen to good people? And he has good hair, so you might as well just enjoy it. It's going to be good. You're going to love it. So we're only going to go over this briefly today. So one reason why we suffer is to grow. This is my least favorite reason, and I hate this reason a lot, and it still makes me grit my teeth a little bit every time that I think it and say it. And I was kind of hoping when he told me that I was going to be preaching on suffering that I wouldn't have to do this part, that this would not be up, like we're going to skip this part. Why do we suffer? To grow. Everybody says it, everybody knows it, and we all hate it. It's just the way it is. But we do. We suffer to grow, but we suffer to grow through God. We don't suffer to grow because we want to grow in our bitterness. We don't suffer to grow through anger. We don't suffer to grow through hatred or breaking apart other people's relationships or our own relationships. We suffer sometimes because we need to grow in God, and we have not learned the lesson some other way. God's first choice is not to make us suffer. Sometimes we just don't learn the lesson. God's first choice was for everyone to be perfect and live in the garden forever and everyone's happy. But that is not what we did. He gave us free will because he loves us, and he refuses to force us to love him. So he gave us choices. Sometimes our choices lead to other things, which we'll get into. Sometimes we suffer just because we have not grown in some other way. Whether we like it or not, like I said, we don't think it's fair, but that's just because we can't see the ending. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not. And you know what? Hard lesson, some things just aren't fair. But God is always fair. Another reason why we suffer is because we're being attacked. We are not being attacked by God. And that's something that we'll talk about today. We are being attacked by the enemy. God does not attack. We also can be suffering because of our own sin, because of other things that we do, consequences that we have. So let's go back to why we suffer. We suffer to grow. 2 Timothy 3:12 says, "Indeed, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." We will. It's not a question. I know Nate has said this a million times, that if someone has ever told you that in life, Christianity is going to be super easy and everything's going to be great and you love Jesus and now everything's happy, that's not how it works. It would be really nice if it did, but that's not realistic, because if everything was great and perfect, we wouldn't be living in this world. Because even if we were perfect, we're surrounded by people who maybe aren't, sometimes, not necessarily. We're going to be surrounded by sin. We're going to be filled with sin. Hopefully, the level of sin gets smaller and smaller as we grow and grow, but we're still going to have it within us because we're humans. And we need to remind ourselves that we're humans, and there will be suffering, and it will grow us if we allow it to. We can either, like the quote said, be mean and irritable and intolerable to live with, which I thought was such a great line in that quote. We can be intolerable to live with. Don't nod, Nate, on this video. I have definitely been intolerable to live with. I spent a solid decade of my life just being, probably longer, the most bitter, angry, frustrated, just bitter. The essence of bitterness. And so that is my default setting. That is where I go when I'm frustrated, when I'm feeling negative, when I don't want to grow through God, when I don't want to be persecuted. I become bitter. I become negative. I get cranky. I just do. I'm sure you can't imagine that because I'm such a pleasure. But I definitely, it's a lot of laughing, guys. That's a lot. This is hurtful. But I do. I don't want to be persecuted, and I also just do it to myself. Let's face it. I don't want to grow. I don't want to be persecuted. I want everything to run smoothly. I want ministries to run smoothly. I want everyone to get along and everyone to be happy and everyone to like everyone's idea, but also to have constructive criticism in a positive way. And none of that ever happens in real life because that's not real life, because people have ideas. They have wants. They have desires and thoughts. They have greed. They're humans. So even in the midst of doing what God is telling you to do, even in the midst of being around other Christians, you may be persecuted. We think about persecution as being people who don't love God coming at us. That's not necessarily always what persecution is. Persecution can come from anything that is against what God's will is. And sometimes people don't even realize that they're doing that. Sometimes people don't even realize that they are the ones standing in your way. We can decide we're going to be irritable and intolerable about that, angry and bitter, or we cannot. But that's our choice. We can't control what they do. We can control how we respond to it, how godly we respond to it, how we love them back, how we fulfill the law of Christ. But sometimes the attack just comes from the enemy. Sometimes it just comes from Satan. He does not want us to do good. He does not want us to be good. He does not want us to be godly. 1 Peter 5, be of sober spirit, on the alert. Your adversary, like the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. He's seeking someone to devour, actively seeking. But resist him firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. The enemy is looking actively to devour. I've heard people explain Satan's attacks as kind of sitting back and waiting and like, oh, well, they said this out loud, or they did this, or this happened, so now Satan is going to... He's not just sitting there waiting for us like we're giving him some kind of good idea. Satan doesn't need our ideas. He's very smart, and he's been around for a while. He knows. He knows God. He knows our plans. He can't necessarily get into our minds, but all he has to do is watch our actions for maybe 5 minutes, and he's figured us out. And we give him an awful lot of credit for destroying us. And sometimes we legitimately are attacked by Satan. And sometimes Satan figures out how to attack us because of what we're doing to ourselves and what we're doing to others. Sometimes we attack ourselves. Sometimes the attack comes not just from the enemy, but it comes from our own sin. It comes from our own consequences. So let's look at James. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, gives birth to death. So it wasn't really until I got pregnant with Micaiah and read this verse that I started thinking about it, okay? So first of all, it says that God can't be tempted with evil, and he does not tempt people with evil. God is not cruel. He doesn't bring out this little piece of temptation and say, here, do you want this? Oh, you don't, like a little kid with a dog that doesn't know how to treat animals well? Do you want this? No? Okay. Do you want, no? You want it? You want it? No, I'm not going to give it to you. You can't have it. He doesn't do that. He is not cruel, okay? He doesn't give himself in pieces where one moment he loves you and the next moment he teases you. That is not God's character. He does not tempt people with evil, but a person is lured, it says. He's lured and enticed by his own desire. Remember, Jesus was tempted. The temptation is not the sin. The sin is the action. When the desire, when it's conceived, when there's action, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it's fully grown, gives birth to death. It brings forth death. When I was pregnant with Micaiah, I realized after the 9 months, and I'm not supposed to be able to have children. There's been like 3 doctors that have told me 3 different reasons why I can't have any children at all, ever. You're never going to have children, and I keep having children, so they're wrong. But that's what Nate says to me sometimes. I'll say something, I'll be like, I don't think you were telling me the truth. And he's like, well, you told me you couldn't have children. That's his backup for everything I've ever said. Anytime I say something, he's like, well, you lied. You told me you couldn't have any kids, and look what we've got now. So, great. Thanks for that, buddy. Like, you got to come up with something new. So, when I was pregnant with Micaiah, I had read this verse. And I thought about how long it takes between conceiving something and giving birth to something. That is a process of formation and developing and growth. And sometimes it feels like it's 5 minutes, and sometimes it feels like it's 12 years. But that 9 months is going to go by regardless. Whether you've been pregnant or not, whether you have children or not, you've seen a child, and you've seen babies, so you know how this works. There is a process between there was nothing, and now there is a human. Think about how miraculous that is, that you were at one point nothing, and you have lived this life now. You have influenced other lives. God has used you in different ways. It's a beautiful thing, but when you think of it in terms of sin, it's conceived. We walk into the temptation, we act on it, we create it. It's created. It develops. It forms into sin. After it forms into sin and the sin continues, when it's fully grown, it brings forth death. It's not just a one-drop shop. Like, it's not just a one-step process. There is a formation and a development to it, and these are our consequences. These are the consequences of our actions that we don't like to take responsibility for. There's a lot of things going around now on Facebook, online, pretty much everywhere you look, in every store. You can't really avoid it. Even people who do not believe in God, people who are not Christians, say things like this: favor is coming for you. God is making a way for you. Your victory is coming. God is going to do it for you. You don't have to do anything. You just have to wait for God. Well, sort of, maybe, sometimes. I don't necessarily think that that is always wrong in every circumstance and situation. Exodus 14:14 says that the Lord will fight for you. That's what he told Moses and the Israelites. Just be still, and I will fight on your behalf. But at the same time, God calls us throughout the Old and New Testament to be responsible for our actions and to act in a way that is godly and holy, and to walk toward him and to develop a relationship with him and not just stand around waiting for him to do something for us. I mean, here's a great example. This morning, I was getting my beautiful, wonderful, God-created children ready for church. We all can tell where this is going. And one of them, who is small and has curly hair and looks just like her father, could not get her coat on, as she has not been able to get her coat on for the last 4 years and 9 months. Ever. So, because here's what happened last night. I was like, your zipper looks stuck. Do you want me to fix it? No, I got it. And then she came in without her coat on, so I thought everything was fine, right? That was my first mistake. So this morning I said, please put on your coat, and I tossed her her coat. So she's trying to put her coat on, and then she couldn't get it on. And then I had to run upstairs to find something, and I came back down, and she couldn't get it on still. And then I came out, and I had already wanted to be here like 10 minutes before that, and I said, okay, let's go, let's get in the car. And she's just sitting on the garage floor. It's 30 degrees out. She's sitting on the floor of the garage with no shoes on, no coat, weeping, just weeping. And Micaiah is just on the other side of the garage, just like, I can't. He's not even helping at this point. He's past helping. He's done, finished. And I was like, what is the problem? She's like, oh, my coat is stuck. And because my coat is stuck, I couldn't use my shoes. And because my shoes were stuck, I couldn't go anywhere. And she just lost her mind, lost it, the whole thing. And I was like, what is happening? But that's how it goes. We take one step and then the next step and then the next, and it builds and it builds and it builds. And to us, that's just a silly little story about a child, but isn't that exactly the same way we live our lives? Everything a child does is just the same thing that we do as adults with different circumstances, which is very frustrating to me as a mother. It's quite lesson building. But if she had just stood there, like she did, and not done anything, would she have ever gotten her coat and shoes on? No. So I came out, not at all frustrated in any way, cool and calm, as I usually am. And wow, Dave, that was a big laugh. And just cool and calm, and I said, child, what are you doing? And she gave me the whole sob story, and I said, well, why didn't you just ask for help? If you had unzipped your coat last night or told me the zipper was stuck, I could have helped you, and then you would have gotten your coat on, and then you would have your shoes on, and everything would be fine. And she's like, but I was just standing here waiting for you to notice. And I was like, oh, you just became a sermon illustration, my friend. She was just standing there waiting for me to notice, which is only cute if you're talking about a 4-year-old. It's not cute when you're talking about us and this whole idea that we suffer because of our own sin. We suffer because we aren't willing to ask for help. We suffer because we won't help ourselves. We suffer because we won't allow help. We suffer because of the consequences of our actions. So whenever people are saying things like, favor is coming, just stand there and wait for God. Sometimes you do need to stand there and wait for God. And sometimes you don't. Sometimes you need to move. Sometimes even if what your movement is taking one tiny step forward and saying, okay, God, I just believe in you. I just believe you're going to do this because there's nothing I can do about this situation. I know you're going to take care of it. That's stepping out. But there are very few times where God says, don't move at all. Just stay right there. More often than not, God is going to call you into something, even if it's just greater faith, even if it's just to grow. Sometimes we grow out of our own consequences. Sometimes we grow because it's part of the plan, whether we like hearing that or not. Sometimes we grow because we're attacked. There's a lot of reasons why we suffer. God is not going to leave any of it behind and leave it useless, though. He wastes nothing. So regardless of what the situation is and whatever we have to step into, we can influence it with godliness. Whatever our circumstances are, whatever our suffering is, we can influence it with godliness, whether we can change it or not. Right now, Nate is in a hospital room with his grandmother. He can't change what's happening, even if he wants to. I know that if he could, he would magically snap his fingers, and she would be 20 years younger and running around. They did ministry for like 50 years. She'd be running around, helping people. Strangers would be living in her house. These are the things that she did. They moved all over the place rebuilding churches. When a church was about to fail, they would help it come back to its feet, and then they would go to the next place, and that was their ministry. That's what they did. I know that he would do that if he could, but he can't. He can't influence it in that way, but he can influence it by loving her. He can influence it by praying for her. When my dad was dying, I couldn't change that, but I could influence it by going to him and praying with him and reading him the Bible. He couldn't see very well at that point. I would do worship with him. There were things I could do to influence what was happening around me in a godly way. Sometimes that's all we can do in our suffering. And I think God gives us that control because we need a little bit of control, and he knows that about us. He wants us to have that kind of influence and peace. It shows obedience, and that's all he's looking for. So when we're looking at why we suffer, we need to look at what the suffering produces. Does it produce losing or learning? Do we suffer to lose and continue suffering? Or do we use the suffering to learn and actually learn from the experience and learn from the consequences and learn from what's happening? So let's look at 2 Corinthians 4. It says, "We are afflicted in every way but not crushed, perplexed but not driven to despair, persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed." So something that Nate put in his slides I thought actually was really pretty good, and I need to put it up in our house somewhere, is learning the list of 2 Corinthians 4. So let's take a look at the list. You can choose which side of the list you want to focus on. You can decide whether you want to suffer and lose part of who you are and lose your joy and continue in the suffering and become bitter and intolerable to live with. Or you can choose to learn from the suffering and from the experience. So let's look at the list. Afflicted, not crushed. So, do you want to learn and do you want to focus on being afflicted? Or do you want to remind yourself that even in our afflictions, we are not crushed? Even when we are perplexed, confused, unsure, we don't understand our circumstances, we are not in despair. I heard a quote this week that said something to the effect of, discomfort will not kill you. And that's what God's been teaching me the past few months. Being uncomfortable will not kill you. It's okay to be uncomfortable. We don't like it. Raise your hand in here if you really like being uncomfortable. All right. Nobody likes it. It's terrible, okay? We don't even buy itchy shirts, okay? Like, we're going to want to be uncomfortable in conversation or life if we can't even handle a tag in the back of our shirt. It's not going to happen. It's not. If Ellie's shoe is not on perfectly, the day is over, the whole day. There's no point. Nate's like, what happened today? Her shoe was on wrong at like 9 a.m., so the whole day's shot. Now I got to just wait till tomorrow. Like, she's not old enough to come back from it, and sometimes we aren't either. Just because we don't understand something doesn't mean we are in despair. We choose to be in despair, but we don't have to be. We can be persecuted, but that doesn't mean we are forsaken and forgotten. Persecuted, not forgotten. Struck down, but not destroyed. If one of my kids falls and scrapes their knee, do I have to cut it off? Do I tell them I'm going to cut it off, and then they're like, no? So I used to hate it when my parents did that. I still do it. I used to hate that so much, and here I am saying it. Struck down. Just because we're struck down does not mean we're destroyed. Just because we scrape our knee does not mean it has to be completely amputated from our body. Just because our left hearing aid fails doesn't mean we don't have the right one. Right, Brenda? Poor Brenda. Pray for Brenda's hearing aid. What? Just because we're struck down does not mean that we are destroyed. It doesn't. We think it does. We feel like it does. But our feelings are not always truth. Afflicted, not crushed. Perplexed, not in despair. Persecuted, not forsaken. Struck down, not destroyed. We choose which side we decide to be on. We can choose either one. God gives us the freedom of choice, but we all know which ones are going to be better and more joyful. Okay? Let's take a look at 1 Peter 1 for a second. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. That ending part just kind of got me, that all these things can result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. I know when we hear revelation, we think end time, end of the Bible. That's not necessarily what this is talking about. The revelation of Jesus Christ is anytime that Jesus is revealed, anytime that he is shown in your life or in a situation. So, the praise and glory and honor can be shown in your circumstances to the people around you, to your own self, to your own family. Anytime that's what you focus on in this suffering and in these trials. This morning I thought to myself, well, whenever I'm suffering, I like to listen to worship music or worship, read verses, do things, read the Bible, pray in a way that makes me focus on the hope as opposed to focusing on the suffering. That's what I tell myself I like to do, right? So, because I used to just focus on the suffering and just be in a bad mood all the time, and I think I've cut that down a bit, but I like to try to focus on what will pull me out of it. It's like when you're angry and you listen to angry music. It's not really helping you. You know, like that was fun when you were a teenager, but is it a good idea? It's not. It's not a good idea. We do it. It's not a good idea. We also eat cheese curds. They're delicious. Are they good for you? No, they're not. We do lots of things that aren't a good idea. This is one of those things we should change. If you want to keep with the cheese curds, that's up to you. We need to focus on things that will pull us out of it. When we're suffering, we can't change the circumstances always, but we can pull our mindset out of it. We can move what's happening in our mind and say, okay, this is my circumstance. This is how I'm going to deal with it. You have to remove yourself from it. So what I was going to share was that I like to, since I'm a musician, I like to listen to worship music a lot. So I was going to share how I liked to stay positive and listen to, worship songs filled with hope when I'm frustrated, even if it's a small frustration and whatever. And then this morning happened with the coat. That was fun. And then the reason I couldn't help her with her coat is because I lost something, and I had to bring it to church this morning. I could not leave the house without it at all. Like I couldn't leave the house without it, and I couldn't find it. I put it somewhere last night. This is the story of my life. I can't find anything in my house. It doesn't matter if my house is completely clean. I could be holding it, sit it down on the counter, and turn around, and it's just magically gone. Like, that's just how my brain works. It's terrible. It's very frustrating. I have no executive functioning skills at all, if you know what those are. So I sat it down last night. I still haven't found it, but I found the other version of it, so that worked. Because I have two. Couldn't find either one of them. I'm running through the house. I was like, I have to leave. The kids are in the garage. It's cold. Please, Jesus, help me find this thing. And I'm like praying out loud, but mostly just complaining to God, because when you're looking for something and you're praying, you're mainly just complaining. Please, God, help me find it right now. Right now, Jesus, help me find it at this exact moment. And you're like throwing things, and you look like a bad movie. There's things flying, and you're like, Jesus, right now. I just need it right now. And then I said this. I said, Jesus, I don't have time for this right now. And it was like everything around me blurred and stopped, and God said, I know what you have time for. And I lifted something, and there it was. And I was like, very, very silent, like a little kid who's gotten caught doing something bad. I was like, oh, he said that was the revelation in Jesus Christ right there. So I found it at the last second. So I like to say that in suffering or frustration, because that's a tiny moment of suffering, but I was really frustrated because I allowed myself to be. I like to say that I think about hope in Jesus, and what I really do sometimes is just complain to Jesus. So I say I'm thinking about Jesus, but I'm really just complaining. And, but I think in the midst of that, we are called to be joyful. What should I have been when I was looking for this thing? Maybe not joyful, but at least thankful that I own it, that I have two of them. I could, you know what I mean? There's a lot of different ways I could have gone about this situation. I did not do any of them right. Probably because I was going to have to preach about it, and God thought it'd be really funny. No, that's not why. Because remember, He doesn't tempt you with evil. But probably because I was going to preach on it, and I was already stressed out, and I allowed my stress to influence my choices. We have to learn to be joyful no matter what. And I think the one important thing about this, and we're finishing up, is that joy is not happiness. Are we always going to be happy? Am I going to be happy that my daughter is crying in the garage floor because she can't zip up her coat because she didn't fix it last night and because she broke her shoes like 3 months ago and that's why she couldn't get her shoes on? Am I going to be happy about any of those things? Probably not. That's okay. I don't have to be happy about it. Society tells us that we have to be happy, that we should do what makes us happy, that we should not put up with other people's choices if they don't make us happy. If this person does something and I don't like it, I don't have to put up with it. That is not necessarily how the Bible works. Does God want you to go through abusive situations where people are treating you badly and ignoring your boundaries? Absolutely not. Does God want you to show grace and mercy and teach others how to love like Jesus does? Yes. Sometimes we won't like the way people act. Sometimes we should walk away, and sometimes we should not. But all society does is tell us that we have to be happy, and we won't be. We're not going to be happy all the time. Sarah's over there with her baby right now. He's adorable and wonderful. Last night at 1 a.m., she messaged me, the baby won't sleep. But guess what? He just started walking because he wouldn't sleep. Was she happy that he was not sleeping? Oh, no. No one's happy then. Nobody's happy when their kids won't sleep, I promise. Was she joyful because her son just learned something that he's been waiting his whole life to do? She was. Because joy is deeper. It's not a happiness. It comes from knowing peace. It comes from knowing that things will be good in the end because God will take care of them. And that joy is what brings us through suffering. Happiness will not bring us through suffering. We could be happy for 1 minute and mad the next minute. We can't expect that to pull us through. We can't. We have to expect joy. We have to hope for joy. We have to walk toward joy like it's an action. We can't just wait for it to come to us like God's favor is coming to you and you don't have to do anything about it. Maybe, but maybe he's expecting us to step out. And sometimes in suffering, we have to step out into joy. We had a testimony last week from Brenda who said that she had to force herself to step out into that joy sometimes, that she was really struggling with depression, she said, and there were moments where she had to reach out even when she didn't really want to. She wants other people to be able to reach out even when they don't really want to. And that was a way that God was faithful to her, that he showed her that she could do that when she didn't feel like she could. Sometimes in suffering, that's what we have to do. We have to act on it because it's a choice. It's a movement. The thing that no one likes about suffering is that it exposes us. It exposes what isn't Christ so we can get rid of what is us. It shows you through suffering what in your life is not like Jesus so you can get rid of it. No one likes that part. I certainly don't. It allows you to separate how you are godly and how you are not. It's like oil and water, and you can immediately see your actions, your choices, your feelings, the consequences of them. Suffering exposes you, and that is why we hide it, and that is why we shouldn't. Because there's not anyone in here who has not experienced suffering. So there's no reason to hide it. There's no reason to put it away and pretend like it's not happening. There's no reason to say, well, I'm not just like Jesus, so I don't want to tell anyone about it. There's no reason for that. We've all been there. We all are there. We're all going to be there. Sometimes to find joy in our suffering, we have to find other people. We should not be doing it alone. Galatians 6:2 says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. The law of Christ, as it says there, is to love God and love others. That's the law of Christ. When we bear others' burdens, we fulfill his law. Here's the thing, though. Bearing each other's burdens doesn't mean that I walk up to Pastor Stephanie and tell her all my problems and make her take over all of my problems and just dump things on her. Unless I have allowed her times where she can come to me and tell me all of her problems, and we do this back and forth, and it's reciprocal. That's what a relationship is. A back and forth communication, a back and forth friendship. If I'm constantly just going to her and dumping on her, that does her no good, except that she becomes a dumping ground. Now, if you're going to someone for counsel, that is a different thing, okay? I'm a therapist. People come to me, they dump on me. That's my job. Dump. Do it, okay? My friends, however, it's a different relationship. We talk to each other, about our own lives, and it's a back and forth thing. In the Bible, it talks a lot about being yoked. Jesus says in Matthew that my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And what a yoke is when there's two oxen, they have a wooden thing that connects the two of them because the burden behind them is too heavy for them to pull on their own. So if one ox was standing here trying to pull all of it, it would get damaged. And oxen are very, very expensive. Farmers did not have enough money to be able to get, you didn't have like an oxen farm. You had the ones you needed, and that was it. And you better hope they stay healthy. And you took care of those guys because they did your work for you. It would be like a tractor. You don't just like leave it out in the rain to get rusty because you need it. Well, one oxen is not enough to do the job. There had to be two. When there was two, they would have that wooden piece behind them. It would connect the two of them, and they could pull it together. What happens if one of them isn't doing the job? Let's say that this guy's not doing the job, okay? And I'm the oxen. I'm trying to pull this thing behind me. Am I going to be able to do that, especially if I'm off to the side and this guy's just eating grass and doing whatever he wants, watching TV, playing Panda Pop? I don't know what he's doing. But are we going to be able to pull whatever's behind us? No, we're not. Both oxen have to carry their weight in order for the burden to be lifted. So this is not a dumping ground situation, but this is a relationship situation. When we learn how to have a relationship with others, we don't have to suffer alone. We're going to suffer, but we don't have to suffer alone. Nate always says, no one cries alone. Okay? In our family, in ministry, nobody cries alone. If you're crying alone, stop choosing to cry alone. Suffering, as difficult as it is, produces perseverance. When we suffer well and we learn from it instead of losing, it produces endurance and perseverance, which we will continue talking about next week. But in order to learn from suffering, in order to learn and become enduring in the whole situation, we have to trust. So this morning, I was just going to end it just like this. I even told Nate, I'm just going to end it normally. And then at 7:53, right before the coat debacle, God was like, or you could just play this song. And I was like, I could, but I don't have it, and I didn't send it to anyone, and I don't even... Nope. And he's like, or you could just play this. Okay, I'm just going to play the song. So sometimes in suffering, we have to trust. And I feel like God has just dropped this on my lap. Maybe it's for me. If it is, you guys can endure it. Enduring produces perseverance. So it's going to be great. But I think that is one thing that in the midst of suffering, in the midst of looking for joy, in the midst of trying to build relationships when we don't want to while we're suffering, in the midst of being vulnerable and honest with one another, we need to trust. We need to trust that God is still good and faithful even when we can't see it. Even when we don't like what he's doing, because sometimes we just won't. We don't have to like it for it to be good.